Hey, everybody. Welcome into Breaking the Huddle. I'm Joel Klatt. This show, as always, is brought to you by Dr. Pepper. It is the one fans deserve. Lots to get into today, and so we're going to kind of jump right in. I've got my thoughts on the CFP rankings. I've got 5 distinct thoughts on that. Some other things that we've got to get into today. We'll answer some questions from Fansville. Lots to do. So let's jump into it right away, because these playoff rankings, they're really where the sport, all the subject matter and discussion in the sport lies within the CFP. So let's see what they gave us this week in the CFP. Number 1, Georgia. Number 2, Ohio State. Number 3, Michigan. Number 4, TCU. 5 is Tennessee. And 6 is Oregon. Now, I've got some thoughts on teams that aren't in the top 6, but let me start with a quick thought on teams that are in the top 6. And the fact that in my rankings, I actually had Michigan at 2 over Ohio State. Now, the committee says Ohio State at 2, Michigan at 3. And yes, it doesn't matter, but I just wanted to explain on this show the reason for why I put Michigan at number 2, and that is I think they're more consistent. Okay, so while Ohio State might have a higher ceiling, I think Michigan has the higher floor. And what was laid bare for all of us to see over the last couple of weeks is the fact that Ohio State is not playing great football on their offensive line. When you get into a game like they had against Northwestern, when you have to run the ball and they know you have to run the ball, can you still dominate? And that's a one-win Northwestern team that they still should have dominated on the ground, and they didn't. So that's a concern moving forward. I don't have that concern with Michigan. The bottom line is this. Buckeye fans, you are crashing weather sites all over the internet, refreshing your weather site to see what the weather is going to be like on November 26th. Michigan fans don't have to do that. It's for that consistency that I moved the Wolverines up to number 2. All right, speaking of my number 2 point on these rankings, let's see and talk about what happened below these top 6, because UCLA lands at 12, USC lands at 8. Make it make sense, committee. Please. Because I feel like I'm taking crazy pills, to take a line from Mugatu. UCLA has a better resume and is right now statistically, I would call it a better team than USC. So how in the world does the committee justify putting UCLA 4 spots behind USC? Now, maybe the Bruins don't care about this, because all it does is it overrates USC a little bit, which they will have the ability to beat that team, and maybe they would get a little bit more of a bump towards the back end of the season. But if you're just looking at this from the perspective of an analyst like myself, you look at it and you're like, hold on. UCLA has 2 wins against CFP-ranked opponents, Utah and Washington. Their lone loss is a better loss than the loss USC took. USC lost to a 2-loss Utah team on the road. UCLA lost to a 1-loss Oregon team, which this CFP committee thinks is a top 16, or excuse me, Sox top 6 team. I don't know why I can't speak. So they have a better loss and 2 better wins, and statistically, they're probably a better team. Even when you look at the stat sheet, you see that USC is struggling on defense. In the last 3 games, USC has given up 524 yards per game and 38 points. They're right now 109th in yards per play defense. I think UCLA is better, and I think that they should be rated higher. Committee, make it make sense, and please don't discount wins, because wins should matter. They are the currency of college football. 3rd point, I think peer pressure works. Not just because it was effective on me as a high schooler. No, it's also because clearly the committee were listening to those of us, like yours truly, that were saying last week, why in the world was TCU ranked behind Alabama, behind Clemson specifically? And all of a sudden, with the exact same scenario that they were faced with a week ago, a 1-loss SEC team in Alabama, and they ranked them ahead of TCU. What did they use for their reasoning? Well, TCU was behind in some games and had to come back. So now all of a sudden you have a 1-loss Tennessee team that probably has a better resume than Alabama did a week ago, and a TCU team that was still down in moments against Texas Tech. So again, the exact same situation. What changed? Peer pressure. We did it, folks. We got them. All right? And I will by the way, be pleased to tell you that this is not peer pressure to like do something that they shouldn't do, which is the way most peer pressure works, in particular when you're a teenager. You know what I mean? No. This is peer pressure in the right direction. So good on the committee for at least evaluating and seeing the mistake that they made a week ago and correcting that this week. All right, fourth thought on these CFP rankings. I don't see a legitimate path for the ACC, and the reason is because of Notre Dame. What does Notre Dame have to do with the ACC, Joel? Well, let me tell you. Notre Dame is not a great football team this year. They've gotten better. Their offensive line is playing remarkably well. They're a one-dimensional offense that throws the ball at a clip of, 115th in the country, and yet they were able to handle Clemson this last week in their home stadium. Notre Dame has not completed over 52% of their passes in any of their last 4 games. They're one-dimensional, and they beat Clemson. But it's not just Clemson. In fact, when you look at Notre Dame over the course of the season, here's what you see. Against everybody outside the ACC, they are 3-3 with losses to Stanford and Marshall at home, and their lone Power 5 win against Cal. Then it's a picture of what they did against the ACC. They're 3-0 against the ACC with wins over Clemson, North Carolina at North Carolina, and Syracuse at Syracuse. Those are 3 of the teams that are in the top half or third of the ACC currently, including the 2 teams that are likely to play for the ACC championship game. I don't see a path in which the ACC champion deserves a spot in the college football playoff. Why? Notre Dame. That's all you got to say. The Irish, everybody. Fifth and last point on these playoff rankings, I want to extend an olive branch and just tell you, hey, committee, I get it. Your job is incredibly difficult. Dare I say, impossible. Why? Because you don't have a set of concrete criteria. And until you do, and until we have more committees and an expanded playoff where we can actually reward teams for playing on the field, all we have right now is a failed experiment in the committee room and a subjective 4-team invitational. So this thing needs to expand in the committee room and on the field as quick as possible. So with that all being said, we're going to take a quick break. I'm going to catch my breath, and we'll be back with more Breaking the Huddle right after this. What's up, everybody? We're back here on Breaking the Huddle. I wanted to get into, on the show, thoughts on Alabama and Clemson, because there was a lot of conversation. I saw a lot on social media about everyone kind of being thrilled, if you will, that there's going to be, hey, new blood. These they're done. Well, I don't think either of these teams are absolutely done as it relates to the playoff picture, although the path is increasingly, very difficult. But I did want to just talk about these 2 teams and what those losses last week actually meant for the sport. So Clemson loses to Notre Dame, Alabama loses to LSU. It's Alabama's second loss, and Clemson, with now a poor resume getting worse, loses that game against Notre Dame, who's not a great football team, and they beat them pretty handily in that ball game. So first and foremost, you have to understand, they have dominated, these 2 teams, the college football landscape in the 8 years of the playoff era. So if you look at the 32 spots that have been available in the college football playoff era to playoff teams, they have almost all of them. 13 of 32 spots for just 2 teams. That's 41% of the playoff. They've occupied 10 of 16 championship game spots. That's 63%. They've won 5 of 8 national championships. That's 63. I mean, either Bama or Clemson have been in the last 7 national title games. They have run the sport, and good for them. Good for them. I'm not sitting here cheering the fact that they're not involved. I am saying, though, it could be healthy for the sport that they might not be involved. That's how dominant they've been. No other team has more than 4 appearances in the playoff. Ohio State, Oklahoma share that 4. And then you've got to go down to Georgia and Notre Dame for the next 2 teams that are most appearances in the college football playoff with 2. So what does this mean? Well, what does it mean? What does it mean for this year? Well, it cleared up the path for TCU. TCU, I think you can argue, is now win and in to the college football playoff. So that's one. The undefeated Power 5 champ, TCU, would likely get into the playoff. The Pac-12, it cleans up their path now to the college football playoff. And I think a lot of people on the West Coast are excited about that because this is the conference that has been left behind in the college football playoff era. Only Oregon and Washington have made appearances. And now you've got this situation where you think to yourself, hey, there's a good chance that Oregon might go or USC might go or even UCLA with a chance to go to the playoff. The other team that it really kind of cleans up, Tennessee. Even in a week in which Tennessee loses, they sit there at 5 in the rankings, and there's a pretty clear path right now to that second SEC team being Tennessee that goes to the college football playoff. So Tennessee benefits from the loss of Alabama and Clemson. And then I think that overarching, you see those numbers and you think to yourself, hey, it's probably good that we have new blood. And I think that those numbers suggest that. Now, I want to also touch on what it means for those specific programs. So that's what it meant for the sport generally, and some teams that it's good for this year. But what does it mean for Clemson and Alabama moving forward in their program? Let's start with Alabama, because I've seen a lot of takes out there that like, hey, this is the end. The dynasty is over. Bama's done under Nick Saban. And I just totally disagree with that. Totally disagree with that. And all you have to do is look at what it took to give Bama their 2 losses this year. Okay, there is no team in America that has played a tougher road schedule than Alabama this year. They had to go to Texas, to Tennessee, and to LSU. Those 3 teams are some of the most talented teams in America, and in every one of those buildings, they're facing at least a minimum of 101,000. In fact, an average of 103,000. And based on what I've told you over the course of the last few weeks in all of these shows, winning on the road is incredibly difficult. And think about what it took to beat Alabama. This isn't even a great Alabama team. We all acknowledge that. They're not what they should be on defense. They don't have the speed on the outside at the wide receiver position. And yet it took a missed field goal from Bama against Tennessee, and then they come back down the field, speaking of the Volunteers, and Tennessee makes a field goal by a yard over the crossbar. They carry the goalposts out of Neyland Stadium. Then LSU, what does it take? It takes Brian Kelly going for 2 in the first overtime to beat Alabama. That's how good Bryce Young has been, even with a team that you wouldn't say is one of the better Alabama teams. They're recruiting at a high level. Nick Saban is not going to let them fall. So all this talk about Bama being done, I totally disagree with it. They had a bad schedule this year. They got beat in incredibly tough environments, and it took maximum effort, playmaking, and luck by both Tennessee and LSU to get those 2 wins. Now, Clemson's a different story. Why is Clemson a different story? Because it wasn't great teams and great environments that beat Clemson. It was Notre Dame. This is a Notre Dame team that's lost 3 games. They lost to Stanford and Marshall at home. Okay, so it's far different when Notre Dame beats you and they do it pretty handily rather than a made field goal and a 2-point conversion. It's a different story. Clemson has clearly fallen below what they were under Dabo Swinney when they had Trevor Lawrence and when they had, Etienne and Hunter Renfrow and Deshaun Watson. This is not the same team. Statistically, they're not even close. They don't run the ball nearly well enough to dominate the terms of a game. You can't go to Notre Dame, a 3-loss team, and lose, 35-14, like get dominated 28-0 at one point in that game, and think that you're still on the upper echelon in the top tier of college football. Clemson has clearly fallen below the bar of where we would put them as it relates to where they were in the playoff era in the last 8 years. Their last 3 losses, Notre Dame, Pitt, and NC State. Alabama's last 3 losses, LSU, Tennessee, and Georgia in the Natty. 2 very, very different trajectories right now, and Clemson's going to have to rally themselves and become better if they want to play to the point where they played in the last 8 years. All right, coming up next on Breaking the Huddle, let's get some questions out there. Questions from Fansville. I answer them coming up next. All right, let's get a little questions from Fansville during this segment right here, and I'll answer anything that you guys have for me. So let's get out to it. Let's go out to Fansville. This one comes in from Michigan Fan. Can 2 Big Ten teams make the playoffs? If so, what is the path? Yes, I do think that they can. I don't think that it's all that likely, but I do think that they can. I think a scenario where Georgia were to win out, Tennessee were to win out, Ohio State and Michigan play an incredibly close game. Incredibly close, right? Like it cannot be more than a 3-point game. And if it's in overtime, it's probably better. And then I think that you would need TCU to lose and the Big 12 kind of to get jumbled up. And I think that you would need some chaos in the Pac-12 as well. And then what you would be banking on, if you were a Big 10 fan, is that with that loss, let's say it's an overtime game, and let's say it's you, Michigan fan. Let's say it's Michigan, loses late on the road in the shoe in overtime, double overtime or something like that. You would be banking on the fact that your resume or eye test is better than Clemson. You know, and with Clemson's loss against Notre Dame, I think that you can make an argument. So that's the path. That's the path for two Big Ten teams. Next up. Sean says, do you think Ohio State will fix its run game before it faces Michigan, the team up north? They might. I've seen them in the past fix their run game mid-season. In the COVID year, and I touched on it at one point, in the COVID year, they weren't running the ball great to start the year, and then they got much better towards the middle and back end of the season. Part of that was because the style of run game in 2019 under J.K. Dobbins was a lot different than what they needed to do with the style of backs that they had in 2020 with Master Teague and Trey Sermon. Part of the problem is that these backs that they have, Mayan Williams and Travion Henderson, they haven't found the right style. They've been trying to run wide zone and be a little bit more of a finesse run team. And in 2020, it wasn't until they got really downhill and let Trey Sermon sit in the pistol and get downhill until they started running the ball more successfully. I think if you got Mayan Williams going downhill, you would fix your run game. And if you got Travion Henderson on the edge, that would be where he would be most successful. But it's certainly something that they have to address because I'm sure you, Sean, have been checking the weather for November 26th. It's like, what's the weather? What's the weather on November 26th? Because right now that might be, the biggest opponent that Ohio State has. Next up, in Fansville. Julia says, out of the teams that became bowl eligible this week or last week, Florida State, Notre Dame, Texas, Kansas, Duke, Minnesota, etc., which one impresses you the most? I thought that the two that I was most impressed with, because of the way that they played their games, is Notre Dame and Texas. And the reason I'm impressed with Notre Dame is because they've gotten so much better since the first two games of the season. So this is a team that really can't throw the ball. They're 115th throwing the football in passing offense. They're totally one-dimensional, and yet they've gone out there and dominated games with their offensive line. That's really difficult to do. And it's not like Clemson is bad stopping the run. The strength of the Clemson team is in their front seven. So I was very impressed with Notre Dame did. They were great on special teams. Their defense was really good, and their run game was really good. So I give Marcus Freeman a lot of credit. Why was I also impressed with Texas? Well, winning at Kansas State is not easy. Just ask Mike Gundy in Oklahoma State. That's number one. But number two is they were able to correct what has been a problem for them in the past, which is holding on to leads in the second half. They were finally able to do it. And I think that they found the formula that allowed them to do it, which is running the football. Bijan Robinson, over 30 carries, over 200 yards. And I think that type of mentality and toughness out of Texas was something that's going to pay dividends for them here down the stretch as they go back home to face TCU. They're going to get Baylor in their home stadium. And if they take care of business in their home stadium, they're going to find themselves in the Big 12 championship game playing for some hardware. So those were the two teams that I was most impressed with. All right, that'll do it for Fansville. Man, it's been a fast show so far. One more segment to go. We'll be right back. Big Noon Kickoff will be live in Columbus this Saturday. Gus, Ginny, and I will be there for Big Noon Saturday. Here we go. The fellas are going to be there. Can't wait for it. Ohio State, Indiana, coming up from the shoe. There's a few other really good games, by the way, this weekend that I'd love to just mention before we get out of here. TCU at Texas. That's going to be a fantastic game. Texas is favored by 7. By the way, Texas, if you want to be a top-tier team, you got to play like it at home. Under Sark, you're 8-3 at home. All the great teams in America play better than that at home. Georgia, 33 of their last 34 wins. Bama, 49 of the last 50. Clemson, 59 of the last 60, including 38 straight. Oregon, 23 straight. Ohio State, 35 of the last 36. If you're a good team, you win at home. So Texas, you better win at home, and you probably better cover that 7. LSU and Arkansas, that's a great game. LSU only favored by 3? This feels like a trick, right? Anybody else out there, guys? You know, like when your wife walks out and you're like, do these jeans look good on me? And you're like, yes. LSU -3, yes. I would probably take that. Feels like a trick, taking LSU all day long. Washington, Oregon, that'll be a great battle in the Great Northwest. That's a bad matchup for Oregon. They're at home, which means that they're probably going to win. But they're favored by 13.5, and they've got the 117th ranked passing defense, and they're facing the top passing offense in the entire country. Michael Penix, Washington, they can throw it around a little bit. So I actually think Washington covers the 13.5, but Oregon wins their 24th straight game in Autzen Stadium. That's going to do it for us today here on Breaking the Huddle. By the way, if you do that parlay right there, so Texas 7, LSU 3, and then Washington getting 13.5, you can bet 100 to win $711. That's Breaking the Huddle, folks. It's brought to you by Dr. Pepper, the one fans deserve. We'll see you next week.